Welcome to I Collect, the show where I show you what I've collected and tell you whether or not it's worth your time. Today I'd like to go over and show you the Super Game Boy, but we have a lot to cover, so let's move straight to design. This is the design. It's actually quite simple. It was designed to look like a Super Nintendo game. This, in its own right, is marketing genius. Why? Well, it plays Game Boy games. That was the initial intent to releasing this thing. It allowed you to play Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo. The idea here is that if somebody had a Super Nintendo, but not a Game Boy, and they bought this was cheaper than a Game Boy and would allow them to test out the Game Boy games. If they like the Game Boy games, of course they'll buy a Game Boy because they want to take the game with them. And at the same time, it was absolute marketing genius to allow people that already had a Game Boy but not a Super Nintendo the chance to play it on their TV. Now, they already like the Game Boy games, so are they going to say no? Of course not. Even I was taken aback when I knew that this thing existed. I did not have a Super Nintendo at the time. I actually had a Nintendo and a Game Boy. And this is one of the things that prompted me to get a Super Nintendo. Not so much the Super Nintendo games, but the idea that I could play these games on the TV. I mean, certain games like Pokemon and things like that, they run really well on those systems and they are fun. But the real appeal, for some reason, is when you're at home, you don't want to play on a tiny little screen. You want the big screen experience, and being able to use the Super Nintendo controller and save your batteries was a really big deal. This looks nice. It's sleek. There's really nothing I could say bad about this. They knew what they were doing when they released this. This thing is marketing genius. The design is flawless. This is a double plus. Let's move on to size. Size. The size of this, once again, comes right back down to what I said before. This thing is marketing genius. They could have made this thing look 1,000 different ways. And how do I know this is true? Because look at the Sega Genesis. You turned it into a toilet at some point in your lifespan, and there was no reason to do that. The thing looked clunky, the thing looked ignorant, the 32X was a giant bulking terror of a piece, and even the game Sonic and Knuckles kind of looked awkward when you put it into your system and opened it up and allowed you to put something else in there. And let's not forget the clip piece that came that you could put into the Sega Game Gear, the Nomad or whatever, that would allow you to play games on that system. They all look goofy. This looks perfect. I already talked about the design, so I don't want to get too much into that again. But the size of this thing is essentially your Super Nintendo games. What this means is that it's very easily storable. Wherever you store your Super Nintendo games, this will be there. That makes it easily accessible, it makes it easily storable, it fits in the system, in both the systems, the newer one and the older one, and it's just brilliant. There was no reason to make it any bigger, no reason to make it any smaller. This is exactly what they needed to do. Any device that you have that holds Super Nintendo games already, this will fit in. That's brilliant. Size is a double plus. Let's move on to product. Alright, the Super Game Boy was launched in 1994. It retailed for $60. Once again, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself so much, but this was marketing genius. The idea here was to allow for a cheaper Game Boy to be on the market that would play on your TV. Anybody that didn't have a Game Boy could buy this and a game, and then they could play the game on their TV, testing it out, for only $60 instead of the retail price of about $100 that the actual Game Boy was. And if they ended up liking this thing, they would then, of course, buy a Game Boy. That's absolutely brilliant. Now, the product itself was specifically designed for one major purpose. Aside from getting you to buy more stuff, it was to play Game Boy games. Why is this thing special? Well, how do I explain this? Let's go with something like Pokemon. Just about everybody knows this game, so it's pretty easy to identify this. Pokemon, like all Game Boy games, runs on a very, very strict system like all of these. The color palette is only 4. This means that on the screen at any given time, no matter what you're playing, no matter how advanced your Game Boy is, this game only has 4 colors on screen at any time. 4 shades of gray, or if you got it on your Game Boy Color, 4 shades of color. No more, no less. Always 4. This was not restricted by the same idea and could have multiple colors on the screen in different areas, such as a palette for simply just the life bars could be up to 3 or 4, while at the same time the character model could be up to 3 or 4, and the background could be up to 3 or 4, somewhere around 16, maybe even 20 different color palettes on screen at once, which could make your games look a lot better. I could talk about this all day, but if you really want to see it, the only way to do it is to, of course, show it to you. So I'm going to play a couple of these games, and then I'm going to make a decision. Now, why Killer Instinct? Well, I wanted to show you that there was another thing going on with the Super Game Boy. It turns these games, not only upgrading them in color, but also advances them to console level. The idea here is pretty simple. It turns Killer Instinct into a 2-player game, which I would love to show you. But I, don't have any friends.
Alright, let's do this.
What? How did you even get here?
Editing mistake. In your favor. Let's do this.
Okay. Frienda? Now you can hit start. I keep hitting the wrong button and keeps turning the power on and off. Or are you doing that? That was one of the things about this, that you could create your own color schemes too. That was basically the only thing I really wanted to show off, was that it does become a 2-player game, especially in your fighting games. Now, did I say it makes these games better? No. And if you have the actual Killer Instinct, it's probably better that you just play that. But it is still kind of fun to be able to beat up your friends on a Game Boy. The only issue here is that you have 4 buttons instead of 2. And this can kind of mess you up because as you're trying to play, you may accidentally end up hitting the other buttons. The other buttons turn the color on and off, or to kind of like an inverted color scale, and it looks terrible. You'll also notice that most all of the games have this type of borderline thing going on. And it adds a little bit of character to the game, but it's not really that great. So, let's move on to another game, something that I can really show off what the system is capable of. Alright, let's play Zelda. That's exciting right there. You guys ever played such good Zelda? That's something else, right? All right, let me explain what just happened. This game is a Game Boy Color game. When this thing came out, it was designed to play all black cartridges and gray cartridges, with a couple of exceptions. Things like Pokemon and things like that will work in it. There were games out there, from what I've heard, there were games like this that did work, but most all of them do not. Should I mark the system down for this? No. Because when it came out, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Grading by today's standards, I could possibly be irritated that I can't play all of my games, but there's a system that will allow us to do that too, and I'll cover that another time. But for right now, let's just focus on the games that we can play. You'll notice that the colors will be a lot better on this one. I'm guessing they stepped it up because it was Zelda. I didn't really want to sit down and play this, even though I could. I'll give a slight opinion. I think this is by far one of the best Zelda games ever made, and sadly it was for the Game Boy. Some people missed out on it for that reason alone. If you can get your hands on this, play it. I just wanted to show you that the color palette was a lot higher than what you would have seen on the Game Boy. If you put this in your Game Boy, it's all gray. That means that this game was designed with the Super Game Boy in mind. They knew that they could put a whole bunch of colors on the game that you weren't going to be able to access on the Game Boy, but you were going to be able to access on the Super Game Boy. Once again, that is marketing genius. Let's move on. That was really all I wanted to go over, was just to show you the product in general. I'm going to give this thing a double plus. It does exactly what it promised me it would do. It allows me to play my games on my Super Nintendo. So, let's move to our last thing, cost. Cost of the Super Game Boy. Originally launched at $60, I said that. Today, this thing is easily obtainable. You could find them at pawn shops. I found mine at a comic store. I found another one of mine on eBay. I have like 3 of these. Look, if you have $10 or $15, you can have a Super Game Boy. Some of these games are super cheap. That Zelda I pointed out, that's $5. There, pay $20, play Zelda. It's going to be amazing. You won't regret it. You'll play it on your Super Nintendo on a TV, like a big Zelda experience. It'll be like a old-style console game. So I have to give this a double plus too. I have to say that this thing is awesome. Let's move to the conclusion. All right, let's not drag this out any more than we absolutely have to. This thing, its design, it got a double plus. That puts us at a 2. Its size, it got a double plus. that puts us at a 4. Its product, it got a double plus, now we're at 5. Its cost, that got a double plus, it got a 5. Look, this thing is a 5 out of 5. It's absolutely worth your time. This has been I Collect, where I show you what I've collected, and today, it's worth it.